This video was made possible by viewers like you, through the Wait in the Wings Kickstarter and Patreon. They knocked 3 times. The booms bounced off the homes of Garnett Street and interrupted a quiet spring morning as 2 brothers played in their living room.
Henry and I were standing by the window, just gazing out of the neighborhood, and suddenly we saw 2 soldiers marching up our driveway. They stomped at the front porch, stomped to the front door, and with their fists began banging on the door. Henry and I were startled and petrified. My father came rushing out, answered the door, and one of the 2 soldiers pointed his bayonet at my father's face. I mean, Henry and I were just frozen. That bayonet pointed at him. And then my father said, I need some time. I gotta help my wife with the backache. And they said, no, you gotta go. I said, 5 minutes. And they said, okay, 5 minutes.
George Takei knew fear. He knew uncertainty, resilience, and survival. 7 decades later, he retold his story sitting in the New York City office of the Schubert Organization. In between then, Takei had piloted the USS Enterprise across the stars as the courageous and intelligent Hikaru Sulu in the original Star Trek series. But now, sitting across from the Schuberts in 2014, he took the helm of a project much more personal to him. A musical about the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the United States government forcibly removed 120,000 people from their homes on the West Coast and detained them in remote concentration camps across the United States, including George Takei and his family. Their crime? Being of Japanese descent.
We were loaded onto a truck filled with other Japanese American families and their luggage and taken downtown to Little Tokyo. And hordes of people were amassed in front of the Buddhist temple, and there was a row of buses on the curb. And then we were loaded onto one of the buses and taken to Santa Anita, where we were herded over to the stable area and assigned our stall to sleep in. I mean, that was a terrifying morning.
Takei turned fear into strength. He used his fame to fight for the justice of Japanese Americans, LGBTQ+ rights, and civil liberties on a national stage. Now he wanted to bring his fight to Broadway with the musical Allegiance. But finding a theater was an uphill battle. Theater owners weren't sure of the commercial appeal for a musical exploring one of America's darkest chapters. Not to mention, most of the show's creative team had never worked on Broadway. This is the story of a lawyer and a tech entrepreneur who teamed up with a Hollywood icon. Of the 7-year battle to bring their musical from concept to reality, of the conflicts, rewrites, and doubts that got in the way, and of a passionate group of people who fought to ask one question. Do you comply, or do you resist? This is the story of Allegiance.
Yes or no? You must choose. Choose your loyalties. Do you persist? Will you resist?
This is the craziest Broadway story I think that might ever exist. You know, you always dream about moving to New York and making it big, meeting all the celebs, and the idea that you could go to New York and meet your childhood hero on your first week there was just an insane one. But that's exactly what happened.
Jay Quo spent most of his time working in the district attorney's office. When the 40-year-old lawyer from California wasn't dealing with bureaucracy or office politics, he went home and blogged his frustration on the website LiveJournal.
Under a pseudonym, I was like live journaling things I didn't like about the law and, you know, the office I was in and all these things. And I got caught. And Kamala Harris fired me, which I think is a sort of a badge of honor. So I said, well, you know, this is as good a time as any to switch careers. So I said, screw it. I'm going to not be a lawyer for a while. I'm going to go write musical theater.
The drastic career change didn't come out of nowhere. For years, he juggled the life of a lawyer and a theater maker. He argued cases and filed motions during the day, then composed music and wrote scripts at night. His most recent show, Homeland, which dealt with star-crossed lovers from white and Korean families, received a fairly warm reception in San Francisco. But now unemployed, Quo was ready to chase his theater dreams in New York City.
Everyone thought it was absolutely crazy.
Well, almost everyone. Lorenzo Tione came from an entirely different world than Quo. An immigrant from Italy, Tione made a name for himself in the tech world when he founded the company PowerSet, which focused on creating a search engine that didn't rely on keywords like Google. The two sometimes hung out in the same social circle, but they became closer after Tione saw a production of Wicked and started learning more about the world of musicals. He even built a set for one of Quo's shows. Tione was also in a bit of a transitional phase in 2008 after he sold PowerSet to Microsoft for $100 million. His technology provided the key framework for Microsoft's Google alternative, Bing. Liberated from their day jobs and looking for their next challenge, the two moved to New York City together.
They called us J-Lore after like J-Lo because she was hot at the time. And everyone thought we were a couple because we actually bought a property together. And we finished each other's sentences and never had sex with each other, just like a couple. So it was a really heady, fun time.
J-Lore were determined to meet anyone and everyone in New York City. Producers, investors, general theater lovers. This meant they needed to see a lot of theater, which brought them to a tiny theater off Broadway.
I never really had a desire or a dream to work in the theater, but it was always something that I enjoyed as a theater goer. And we were in the theater. I think we were seeing Forbidden Broadway, and the house was sparsely attended, and so the ushers came and moved us from a back row to a one further in the front, and all of a sudden I'm hearing a voice I recognize behind me.
That signature baritone talking behind me. Well, what theater are we going to see tomorrow, Brad? And they started talking about the title of a show, which I had just seen. So I turned around and said, you're going to love... Oh my goodness, Mr. Takei. Hi.
And I turn around and it's like George Takei and his husband.
So we chatted, and generally about theater and musical theater. And we thought, well, these guys really are intense musical theater fans.
And we just thought it was really cool to meet George like that and talk about theater. And we watched the show and we thought, that's a great story we're going to tell one day.
And the next day we decided to go see In the Heights. I walked into the theater. We found our two seats. We looked down the aisle. The two guys are waving at us. It's the same two guys we met the night before, Lorenzo and Jay.
And Brad leans over to George and says something. I heard later that he said, I think they're stalking us, George.
In the first act of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical In the Heights, one of the characters sings a song called Inútil. a Spanish word for useless, where he talks about feeling insecure and guilty that his sacrifices for his daughter were worthless. When the lights came up for intermission, Tione and Quo made their way over to say hi to George Takei. They walked up on him, wiping away a stream of tears.
I'm one of those people that's called a weeper in the theater. I started crying, and the song finished, and I just lost it.
And I said, I'm just so curious, like, why were you so affected by that song? And I think it's a good song. It's just not, nobody else was crying at that song.
Sitting in the partially empty theater, George told them his story.
Hello, NBC. This is KGU in Honolulu, Hawaii. We have witnessed this morning the distant view, a brief battle off Pearl Harbor, and a severe bombing of Pearl Harbor by enemy planes, undoubtedly Japanese.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. I ask the Congress declare a state of war.
"20 miles outside of Cody, Wyoming, two worn-down buildings and a single brick chimney dot the hills beside Route 14. Below them, a lone wooden watchtower. These are the remaining structures of Heart Mountain. It was one of 10 concentration camps built in the United States for one purpose: to imprison any person of Japanese descent that lived on the West Coast."
Over the course of the war, there were about 14,000 people who called Heart Mountain their home. And that made Heart Mountain, Wyoming, the third largest city in Wyoming. Even today, it would probably still be the third largest city in Wyoming, where we are, a rural state with small communities. And so to have a town of 10,000 just pop up overnight was really extraordinary and very disruptive. My name is Aria Sunada Newland. I'm the executive director of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming Foundation.
On paper, military officials and the US government claimed the decision for mass incarceration stemmed from a concern for national security following the attack on Pearl Harbor. The reality was a little more complicated.
There had been decades of anti-Asian sentiment in the United States, first starting with anti-Chinese sentiment and then anti-Japanese sentiment. And this was a population that was very successful on the West Coast, particularly with farming. They were seen as an economic threat. And so for decades, business owners and farmers on the West Coast were trying to exclude these unwanted others. And it was Pearl Harbor that kind of gave the final excuse, I suppose, to exclude everybody and place them into camps.
In the months before Pearl Harbor, the State Department and the United States Navy were already investigating possible domestic sabotage tied to foreign governments, particularly Japan. In both government-commissioned reports, the conclusion was the same. There was no large-scale spy network, and most Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans were loyal to the United States. But after the attack, evidence gave way to suspicion. Rumors spread that the Pearl Harbor attack was an inside job by a fifth column of Japanese spies. The media fueled the paranoia, and even Dr. Seuss contributed to the hysteria. Within 24 hours, the United States officially entered World War II. Within 48 hours, the FBI began mass arrests without warrants, detaining over 1,200 people. Primarily Issei, or first-generation Japanese, community leaders, newspaper editors, school teachers, and even Buddhist priests. That crackdown expanded when Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the Army to take any measures to remove threats from the West Coast.
Didn't name any race, but everyone knew it was about the Japanese. Army created the Western Defense Command. They came up with a plan to create 108 exclusion zones on the West Coast from which they could remove all of the ethnic Japanese. I'm Frank Abe. I'm lead author of a graphic novel called We Hereby Refuse, and co-editor with Floyd Chung of an anthology called The Literature of Japanese American Incarceration from Penguin Classics.
During the spring and summer of 1942, every person of Japanese descent living on the West Coast was forced to board a bus to nowhere. They were only allowed to take what they could carry. Families were forced to sell their vehicles, homes, businesses, and rich farmland for pennies. Out of everyone rounded up, roughly 2/3 were legal American citizens.
I mean, they categorize us as enemy alien, but we were Americans. It was a category that they just made up out of thin air.
The president caved to the West Coast congressman. He caved to the agricultural interests, the farm owners who coveted the rich farmlands that had been cultivated by my grandparents' generation, the immigrant Japanese in California, Oregon, and Washington, so that these lands could be, seized, transferred, lost into white ownership.
The order never said what would happen next, only that people had to go. This meant the US government needed to figure out where to put 120,000 people. The first stop was a network of assembly centers, rapidly converted from racetracks, fairgrounds, and exhibition halls. Families were crammed into makeshift barracks that still smelled of livestock, the air thick with the stench of manure that no amount of cleaning could quite erase. It was a holding pattern in every sense, built to give the government time to construct something more permanent.
My name is Sam Mihara. I am a second-generation Japanese American, born in San Francisco, raised in San Francisco until I was forced to go to the Heart Mountain camp during the war. I went to Pomona first, the assembly center in Pomona, California. And it was pretty bleak. It was a state fairgrounds, and they turned the parking lot into barracks.
In Los Angeles, it was the Santa Anita racetrack. In San Francisco, it was the Tanforan racetrack. Large areas where you can just mass people and put them into these crazy shacks that were built within 2 weeks.
We were in the worst was a Santa Anita. Other people were taken to fairgrounds where the livestock were housed, whether it was in Seattle or whatever temporary housing they can find.
I remember living in those awful, very, very small barracks with thin walls and no ceiling. We were there for 3 months, which is the time it took to build the permanent camps.
Many Issei rarely spoke of their evacuation or their time in the camps due to shame, trauma, cultural values, or language barriers. But George Takei's father was different. Sitting in the theater at In the Heights with Jay Kuo and Lorenzo Tione, Takei told the two how the song took him back to after-dinner conversations he used to have with his father.
I was a child when we were incarcerated, and I wanted to know more about it. And my father was one of the few parents of that generation that did talk about it. I asked him about his feelings, and he said he had 2 boys, me, I was the older one, 5 years old. My brother Henry was 4, and we had a baby sister who was a toddler. he'd see the two of us playing on the dirt road, and beyond us with a barbed wire fence, and in the swamps beyond that, the two hopes that he had for the future, growing up behind the barbed wire fences, and it tore him up. And he shared those feelings with me.
He told me his father was feeling ashamed that he couldn't help his family in their time of need. He tells a gripping story about how he confronted his father once after dinner and said, "How come you didn't do anything? You led us like sheep to slaughter." And his father just looked sort of ashen and crestfallen and said, "Well, maybe you're right." And then got up and left the table and shut the door. And George felt terrible. And he never got a chance to sort of say he was sorry for that. He later learned how much his father had struggled to try to keep things as normal as possible for their family. But it involves a lot of hiding of the awful truths.
And here I was in the theater listening to this Puerto Rican father feeling inútil, useless.
The lights flashed to signal the end of intermission. When the second act started, Jae-Kwo's mind was elsewhere. He vaguely knew of the mass incarceration from his law school days, when he studied the landmark case Korematsu v. United States, which held that national security outweighed individual rights. But hearing a first-hand account from George Takei was different. After the final curtain dropped, Tione and Kwo approached the Takeis one more time.
And I said, I just blurted it out. I said, "Mr. Takei, this is the most incredible story I think I've ever heard. And I think it would make a great show. We should turn this into a show. I'm a musical theater composer." And he says, "Well, I've always wanted to tell this story the Great White Way." And so I said, "Well, let me do this. If you'll give me your email address, I will send you my ideas and a title song or something, and let me know what you think."
I mean, here are two guys who have never worked professionally in the theater before, and one knows how to raise money and do business, and the other one knows how to write a good song. But we're like, we're gonna write a show, and we're gonna take it to Broadway, because why not, right? But we didn't know how hard it would be.
Surrounded by drunk theater lovers inside Marie's Crisis Piano Bar, Jae-Kwo and Lorenzo Tione rapidly bounced ideas off each other for all the directions they could take with this new musical. But the first thing they needed was a title.
So we're just belting show tunes at the top of our lungs, and look over at the bar on the mirror, and it says "The Rights of Man." It's like randomly there, and Lorenzo's just like, "The Rights of Man. Maybe that's a title."
It was an interesting phrase, and we were both sort of drunk, and we were talking about the title, and we were sitting at the bar, I remember, and we were looking at this mural, and we were looking at these words.
I'm like, it doesn't really ring for me. I think in my mind, when Allegiance started happening, was when George told me the story of how he used to have to say the Pledge of Allegiance from inside barbed wire, looking out at the flag, hand over heart, saying, "With liberty and justice for all." The irony not even evident to him as a child of 5 or 6. But I pledge allegiance, it struck me.
The two eventually settled on the perfect title: Allegiance. Kwo dedicated all his time towards becoming an expert on the history of the 1942 mass incarceration, reading and watching everything he could get his hands on. Though Takei was incarcerated at the Roar Camp in Arkansas and later Tule Lake in California, Kwo decided to place the show somewhere else entirely. As he learned the names of all the camps, one immediately jumped out at him: Heart Mountain.
That sounds epic, romantic. It sounds like something out of a musical, right? And as soon as I looked at that name, and started researching Heart Mountain internment camp. That's when I came across the Draft Resistors and really got pulled into that story.
Within no time, he emailed George Takei a pitch for the show and a demo song.
And he wrote back the same day and he says, "I'm crying once again." And I listened to this moving music. And he says, "You must come down to Los Angeles and let's make this happen." And so that was the beginning that's how Allegiance got started.
As a founding member of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, George Takei believed in the museum's mission of honoring the injustices faced during World War II and educating so those injustices didn't happen again. He felt the museum would be a fitting spot for the first reading of Allegiance in 2009.
And our casting agent, Craig Burns, asked me, "Well, who's your dream actors?" And he says, "Just dream big. Just, who's the top?" I said, "Well, Lea Salonga."
I'm gonna go to the police department. Yeah, that's the more better.
As he grew up, George Takei always felt that movies lacked accurate representation for Asian and Asian American performers. When Asian actors did appear, they were frequently cast in stereotypical roles: the villains, the fools, or the objects of sexual desire. Those stereotypes also rang true for Broadway. Classic shows like The King and I often painted Asian characters as the other, or framing their cultures as exotic and distant. Even one of the most celebrated musicals of the 1990s, Miss Saigon, revealed how far the industry still had to go. When producers put actor Jonathan Pryce in bronzer makeup and eye prosthetics to play the French-Vietnamese character known as the Engineer. Many also argued that Kim, the show's female lead, was built around familiar tropes of Asian women in Western media, particularly her innocence, sexual vulnerability, and dependence on an American soldier for her survival. That said, Lea Salonga pushed beyond the script stereotypes to turn Kim into something more. At just 21 years old, she broke through racial barriers, becoming the first Asian actress to win a Tony Award in the process. After her breakout success in 1991 with Miss Saigon, Salonga started exploring new creative paths. She brought her voice to a whole new generation, becoming the singing voice of Princess Jasmine in Aladdin and Mulan in Mulan, thus cementing her place in Disney history. She didn't leave the stage entirely though, as she joined established productions like Les Mis and revivals like Flower Drum Song. An iconic AAPI star, Tione and Quo knew her presence could bring a lot of visibility and credibility to Allegiance. But Salonga hadn't taken a starring role in an original musical in 18 years, since Miss Saigon took Broadway by storm. In 2009, getting her to join a developmental reading at a museum looked like a long shot. Despite the odds, Tione and Quo reached out. They figured the worst that could happen was she said no, and they looked for a different performer.
Jay and I were friends from our social circles in New York and Fire Island with a casting agent who had worked with Lea several times and asked him, "Hey, would you send Lea this material?" And he says, "Yeah, I mean, I'll send her the material, but she really doesn't do new stuff and she hasn't done anything in the US for a while. I wouldn't have my hopes up." Two things happened that we had no control over, nor we had any idea of. One is that Lea happens to be a big nerd and a Star Trek fan, and the idea of doing something with George Takei was just like tickling.
I'm sure that we had met over the years because we had done projects in common. We were both in Mulan, so I'm sure that in that universe, our paths had crossed, and he had seen me in Miss Saigon and many all those years ago.
But the second thing was that the story of the internment was one that touched her personal life through, sort of history of her husband and therefore their child.
Immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans rushed to enlist and prove their loyalty, only to be turned down at recruitment offices. About 6 months after moving people into the camps, the government realized they had a problem. They were running out of service members in the army. In an effort to bolster its ranks, the US government reversed course and created the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated unit largely made up of Nisei, or second-generation Japanese American, soldiers. The 442 became one of the most decorated units in US military history, liberating towns under Nazi control and breaking through German lines to rescue 200 trapped soldiers of the Lost Battalion, all while their families remained locked in camps back home. They lived and died by one motto: go for broke.
It felt really personal because my, now ex-husband, family, a few of them had served in the 442, and his grandparents had fled to Colorado when folks were starting to get rounded up. So it felt important.
I was in Cabo San Lucas, sort of vacationing, but also talking to prospective investors. And I had a margarita in one hand, and I just opened my laptop, and I'm scrolling, and there's a line that says, Leia is interested. And I dropped my margarita all over my laptop. I remember this really like, it took forever to clean this. I thought I had ruined it, but I was like scanning through it. I didn't even clean my thing. I was scanning through it. She had her agent had a few demands. I'm like, done. That's done. We can do that. Oh my God, we can meet all her demands. She's gonna do this. I was like, oh God. So, and then we have a show. We have George Takei and Lea Salonga, the two biggest names. And so, that we were off to the races.
In July 2009, Tione and Kuo gathered around the piano in George Takei's living room to prepare for the LA reading with Lea Salonga.
They didn't have an access to piano, and we have a grand piano in our living room. And Jay had developed a few songs, and so we invited Lea to our home.
And because there's so much wood in his house, any kind of voice that I was putting out was reverberating all over the place. It was a very live room. His whole house is a very live, resonating room, and
it was such an exciting, thrilling experience to hear her glorious voice singing a couple of songs that Jay had developed, ringing off the walls of our home. It was a real treat for us.
And it was sort of mind-blowing to me that here I was sitting with two of my heroes now. Lea Salonga, I used to listen to the Miss Saigon cast album and dance with my boyfriend to The Last Night of the World, and I actually texted him. I said, you would not believe who I'm sitting with right now. And it was hard not to burst into tears the first time you hear Leia sing a song you've written, right? That's like a dream come true, right?
With George Takei and Lea Salonga confirmed, Tione and Kuo held auditions to fill the rest of the roles. Since a majority of the roles in Allegiance were specifically written for Asian and Asian American performers, Kuo and Tione noticed a pattern that said a lot about the industry. The same few shows kept popping up over and over on actors' resumes: Miss Saigon, Flower Drum Song, and The King and I. Kuo realized this wasn't just a coincidence. If anything, it showed to him how few mainstream musicals existed with AAPI-led casts.
It sort of lit a fire in me too, not only to tell this story in order to bring out a really important aspect of our past, but also to provide a sort of a thoroughfare, if you will, for Asian American talent and opportunities on Broadway.
To be totally honest, I think I approached it more as an artist in the industry, you know, especially within our community. Work is hard to get. So it's not like I had a plethora of other options, but I think realistically speaking, we're all, you know, part of this marginalized community industry where we're not offered as many roles and opportunities as other actors. It sounded like such a really, really incredible project, and you know, all of us for Uncle George will do anything.
The basic script for Allegiance revolved around the fictional Omura family, and drew inspiration from the 10 different camps, the 442, and from George Takei's memory. The show shifted between the early 2000s and the 1940s, following an isolated veteran named Old Sam. After he learns about the death of his former tutor, Gloria, the story moves into the past, following young Sammy and his family during their incarceration at Heart Mountain. At its core, it asked a question with no easy answer. What does loyalty look like when your country is the one betraying you? Gaman is a Japanese term that roughly translates to bearing the unbearable with dignity. When families first stepped off the trains at their inland camp, the vibrant West Coast streets were replaced with desolate deserts and swamps.
We were greeted by the Army guards at Heart Mountain, who were armed, and we got on backs of Army trucks and taken through the main gates. I saw guard towers, sentries with weapons, rifles, and the truck then took us to our assigned barrack.
I'll show you one piece of this barrack unit that we have left exposed. We're protecting it, but we're kind of displaying it. We're assuming that this was written by somebody who worked on building this barrack at the beginning. And in pencil, you can zoom in, it says, a slap for the J word, this racial slur. And so whoever built this barrack wrote that on the wall, the assumption that they left it as a message for whoever would be living here, which is just horrifying, really. I mean, if you can imagine coming to this new place and being crammed into this really shoddy living environment and be welcomed with a racial slur on the wall of your barrack. It kind of captures the sense of what it must have been like to arrive here at first.
Faced with humiliating living conditions and food insecurity, incarcerees leaned into Gaman. The camps were divided into 30 or more blocks. Since each block consisted of 500 people, the War Relocation Authority assigned a block manager to address complaints over food, lack of beds, and other housing problems that started to pile up. George Takei's block manager was his father.
My father had to deal not just with his family, but the other families. He was really a leader, and people came to him for assistance, and he became the pillar of our block, representing us and calming people down, solving people's problems, and there were lots of problems.
In spite of the circumstances, people tried their hardest to create community and gain a sense of normalcy within the camps. At Heart Mountain, a group of journalists created a camp newspaper called the Heart Mountain Sentinel, while others planted thriving gardens in the desert soil. At Takei's camp in Roar, Arkansas, his father helped to put together a camp baseball team, he coordinated dances for the teens, and worked with parents to make sure the children could still visit Santa. Just as life began to resemble something close to normal, a single piece of paper changed everything. The division it caused hung over George Takei as he performed the first public reading of Allegiance in Los Angeles. Located in the heart of Little Tokyo, the Democracy Forum Theater was built to explore the evolving idea of what democracy is and what it means to be an American. The audience settled into their seats as the actors turned pages on their music stands, none of them certain whether this show would amount to anything at all. Then, the piano struck its first notes, and George Takei was pulled back to 1942, into a world of fractured loyalties that tore through his community and his relationship with his father. The wounds from that time never fully healed. They all traced back to two seemingly innocent questions. In the years following Pearl Harbor, the United States government did everything they could to convince the public that Japanese and Japanese Americans were threats that needed to be locked away. But once the military created the 442, they needed to turn opinion again to convince the public that Japanese Americans could be trusted to serve in the army.
The way that the government decided to sort out who from among the camps were suited to serve or not was to give them a questionnaire, and we kind of dubbed this the loyalty questionnaire.
Anyone over the age of 17 was required to fill out the Statement of United States Citizen of Japanese Ancestry form. For the most part, the questionnaire appeared as nothing more than a paper trail for the government, with run-of-the-mill questions. What's your weight? Are you a registered voter? Are you married? But things got tricky when it came to questions 27 and 28. Question 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty whenever ordered?"
A lot of people saw that as something that would indicate their desire to serve. If I answer yes to this question, does that mean that I'm volunteering for the military even if I don't want to? Or in my great-grandmother's case, of course she's not going to serve in the US military. She's past the age.
Meanwhile, question 28 asked, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attacks by foreign and domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or disobedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?"
The Emperor of Japan were Americans, born here, raised here, educated here.
My father, being well educated, he objected to responding. He refused to sign and fill out the loyalty questionnaire because some of the questions were misleading.
These questions were worded in such a way that many Issei couldn't without reservation say yes to each of those questions.
For the Issei, the first-generation immigrants who were not allowed by law to become US citizens, if they were to forswear allegiance to Japan, they would be effectively making themselves stateless. For the Nisei, the second generation, the American-born citizens, they were as American as anybody else. And so they didn't want to put themselves in a corner saying, like, yes, I forswear allegiance that they never had.
And I remember several resisting fellows had meetings in the mess hall after dinner and strategized on how to best resist going.
The loyalty questionnaire divided an entire community. Some believed the best way to prove their loyalty was to answer yes, yes, and fight in the 442. Others chose to resist by answering no, no, and refusing the draft until their constitutional rights were restored. They would still fight, but only if their families were freed.
Heart Mountain had the largest and most organized draft resistance movement of all 10 of the camps. And they were led by what they called the Fair Play Committee.
One of the leaders of the Fair Play Committee was a man named Frank Emmy. Unlike the results of the violent riot at the Manzanar Relocation Center, where military police killed 2 internees, Frank Emmy and others made sure that the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee protests stayed entirely peaceful.
Ultimately, there were 63 young men from Heart Mountain who ended up going on trial for draft resistance. It was the largest mass trial in Wyoming history. And in their case, the judge used a racist slur when he addressed them, and he sentenced them all to 3 years in federal prison for evading the draft, resisting the draft.
The resistors saw those who complied as accepting of injustice and branded them as Inus, or dogs in Japanese. Those who complied saw resistance as a failure of duty and branded them as no-no boys.
I have strong memories of waking up in the middle of the night one night, and my parents were huddled over a kerosene lamp, and they were talking in whispers, and my mother was crying. And I said, "Mama, don't cry, don't cry." And my parents immediately came over and said, "We're having an adult conversation, go back to sleep." My parents are talking about the loyalty questionnaire and how they can respond to it. But they answered honestly, truthfully, no. And with those 2 no's, they were recategorized as disloyals.
The reading at the Japanese American National Museum on July 13th, 2009 hit hard with audiences and left everyone convinced that George Takei's story belonged on Broadway. Jay Kuo and Lorenzo Tione intended to get it there. Director Stafford Arima loved the unconventional. His 2004 show Altar Boys told the story of a Christian boy band struggling with faith and fame on their Raise the Praise tour. In 2010, he started reworking the infamous Broadway flop Carrie, based on Stephen King's horror novel. He also started retooling Bear, a pop opera, a cult favorite portrayal of 2 gay Catholic boarding school students navigating a secret relationship. That same year, another interesting pitch found its way to his desk.
It kind of punctured my soul because it had these 3 words, Japanese American internment. And as a Canadian whose family was interned in Canada, it was a story that I was aware of, but not on a level of perhaps even thinking that it could be a musical one day.
Given the subject matter of the show, Tione and Kuo felt it was important to have someone of Japanese ancestry at the helm. Given Arima's reputation and experience, he felt like the obvious choice to direct Allegiance.
We went to lunch at a Brazilian steakhouse in Hell's Kitchen that is no longer there, and he revealed to us that his family had been imprisoned in camps, that there were camps in Canada. And I think he felt a commitment and a mission and a compulsion to being part of the vehicle through which not only the general public, but also so many Japanese American of 2nd and 3rd generation themselves could learn about the internment in a way that they had not been able to hear directly from their families.
Stafford Arima joined the production. In doing so, Tione and Kuo also scored Arima's go-to music director and orchestrator, Lynn Schenkel.
I heard the piece through and I was really fascinated by the story because this is a story that has never been told. And that is what was so interesting to me about it from the very beginning.
The team held 2 developmental readings in New York, at Playwrights Horizons in February 2010 and the Julia Miles Theater that October. The average time to bring a musical from concept to Broadway is typically 7 to 10 years. In press releases for the readings, Tione announced his plan to do it in 2. He wanted the show to open in time for the 70th anniversary of Pearl Harbor in 2012. The reading aimed to generate interest in an out-of-town tryout for Allegiance. This would give the team a chance to flesh out a full production and gain buzz for a quick move to Broadway. Most of the LA cast returned for the readings, including George Takei and Lea Salonga. For the younger version of Takei's character, Sammy, Stafford Arima turned to Telly Leung, who had only loosely heard about Allegiance through his friend, Michael K. Lee.
Oddly enough, when I first talked to Mike about the show, they said the role of Sammy is a teeny tiny role. You get, one song that Sammy sings at the funeral, but it's a beautiful, beautiful song. And, but it's, that's the only moment he sort of has in the show.
Up to this point, the role of Sammy was a supporting one amongst a vast backdrop of characters. This included his brother, James O'Mara, who joined the 442, his brother's fiancée, Gloria, his parents, a Heart Mountain resistor named Frankie Suzuki, and Hannah, the daughter of the camp director.
And eventually, I remember going to the first day of rehearsal, finally seeing Stafford for the first time for our 29-hour reading, and Stafford saying, I know you think that your character only has one song in the show, but I think Sammy is the lead of the show.
Allegiance came out of its New York readings with real momentum. And suddenly, the question wasn't if the show had a future, but where it would go next. For many, the obvious answer was to take it to Washington, D.C. Given the show's political edge, there was something almost poetic about staging it right at the doorstep of the government whose history it was challenging. That plan changed fairly quickly.
I was telling you about how I was cultivating investors in Cabo, and that's when I got the email about Leia. One of those investors is a woman named Wendy Gillespie who lives in San Diego, and she has this great story she tells. She's like, she walked into the office of the artistic director of the Old Globe, and she says, my name is Wendy Gillespie, and I'm going to write you a check. And you're going to listen to me tell you about this amazing show. I just sobbed.
The Old Globe had a track record for successfully transferring shows directly to Broadway, and agreed to give Allegiance a developmental reading in 2011, followed by a soft commitment to stage a full production. The Old Globe's executive producer, Lou Spisto, just had one condition.
I think very smartly, the then artistic director of the Old Globe was like, love the show, love what you guys are doing, but you've taken a lot of work up on your plate, including producing, and I think you'd learn a lot and have a better product, have a better show if you brought on another writer and collaborated with them.
Allegiance was moving at rapid speed, but if the duo wanted to keep up that pace, they needed to hire a writer. That's where the real challenge began. Nobody would commit, and they only had 3 months until the start of rehearsals. After receiving the green light from the Old Globe, Tione and Quo spent months trying to find a writer, only to hit one dead end after another. They tried John Weidman, the Tony-nominated book writer for Pacific Overtures. They tried Matthew Lopez, the future Tony-winning book writer of The Inheritance. They even tried Philip Khan Gotanda, the playwright of Manzanar, An American Story. All of them passed. After the Old Globe premiered a musical version of A Room with a View in March 2012, Lou Spisto recommended the two get in touch with the show's book writer. During his day off, a teen novelist and former NPR commentator named Mark Aceto took in the attractions of Balboa Park.
Jay and Lorenzo had taken it as far as they could in terms of writing a book, and I actually was interviewed on the phone at the San Diego Zoo.
Finding a spot to sit down in front of the panda exhibit, Aceto made his pitch for allegiance.
George and Leia were both playing parts that were just completely marginal to the story, and they were just sort of completely underused. So I knew that we would have to simply do a complete reboot on the family relationship with all the same themes. At that point, I was mostly a comedy writer. I was not the go-to guy for historical melodrama, but I was so compelled by the bravery and the fortitude of the Japanese American people, and I found a certain intersectionality with it as well, in that, I came of age as a gay man in the summer of Bowers v. Hardwick, and the idea that the police could just barge into your house and arrest you for a consensual sexual act just haunted me as a young gay man, particularly because it was under the specter of the AIDS crisis in 1986. And so I felt like I just had at least a glimmer of what it would be like to have the military show up at your front door and take you away.
The last line of Aceto's bio for A Room with a View read, "A book doctor to writers of all mediums." Allegiance was about to put that to the test. With a cast in place and rehearsals fast approaching, Aceto only had 90 days to finish a complete rewrite from scratch.
The basic show that I inherited was the story of two brothers who were vying for the attention of a withholding father. And I said, that's a really great way to personalize the political. That's a really great idea. I said, there's only one problem. Which brother is Leia Salonga and which brother is George Takei? Because they had an idea about how to tell the story, but it didn't match the stars that they had.
Eventually the role of James would disappear, because eventually what Mark Aceto did was go, I think this is a brother-sister story. And instead of having Leia be the sister-in-law, we should make her the sister. And instead of James going to war, we should have Sammy go to war.
In an attempt to simplify the story, Aceto took a red pen to the cast list. Overnight, Sammy went from a supporting character with one song to the show's lead, playing opposite his new onstage sister, Keiko, portrayed by Leia Salonga. To heighten the conflict between the family, the 442, and the Heart Mountain Resistors, Aceto also made Frankie Suzuki the love interest of Kay. Meanwhile, Sammy's love interest, Hannah, went from being the daughter of the camp director to a nurse in Heart Mountain's hospital.
I killed off the mother. People who had already been hired to work in San Diego, 4 of them lost their jobs because I got rid of their roles. Stafford said to me again on the phone, because all of this is happening at warp speed. We start rehearsals in 4 months. And I remember him saying, well, friend, don't worry about it. I'll take care of letting people know, and you don't have to concern yourself. And then he CCs me on the email he sent to the cast and basically threw me under the bus, letting me know that, Mark Aceto, killer of dreams, is now here to let you know that you are no longer wanted in this particular story.
Once the list of characters became more manageable, Aceto directed his attention to the actual message of the show and the weight of its topic. Even though the 1942 mass incarceration played a major role in Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency and directly affected hundreds of thousands of people, it's often reduced to a footnote in school history lessons. Aceto had to walk a careful dramaturgical tightrope. bringing in this unknown chapter of American history without turning the musical into a 2.5-hour lecture.
And in particular, there was one way in for me, the notion that here are these people, 120,000 people who have been imprisoned for no good reason, and they've been sent to the remotest, most desiccated parts of the country. And because so many of them were farmers, they managed to get crops to grow bountifully in the desert. So much so that they donated the surplus to the American military, the very people who were oppressing them. And in the course of doing my initial research, I came across a photograph of a little boy in the camps who was obviously dressed up for some kind of costume event as a flower. And they had taken cereal boxes and they had cut petals out of them to make these petals around his head. And he was absolutely just about the same age that George would have been as a child. And that idea of blooming where you were planted just seemed to me, that's the show. It's like Fiddler on the Roof. You don't really need to spend a lot of time talking about the oppression coming from the outside because it's self-evident. What's more interesting is all of both the unity and the dissension within the community, I think, is really the heart of it.
Cracking this also helped Aceto write a much bigger role for George Takei. Instead of only appearing as older Sam, he also took on the role of Ochi-chan, or grandfather, the elder of the family. Ochi-chan's quiet strength would make a garden grow in the desert. For his first draft, Aceto focused on shaping the existing script into a compelling emotional story, choosing to dive in without extensive research.
Jay is just a total brainiac. And I said to him, I'm just going to write what I think is good drama. And when I need the facts, I'm going to turn to you. But at least for just this first pass, this first draft, it can't be a history lesson. It has to be a compelling, dramatic story.
It's based upon a true events. It's not a true story. And so we wanted to make that clear because, we wanted to tell the story of 10 different camps. And, they were very different. Tule Lake, conditions were very brutal. And we tell that story a little bit in Allegiance, but we combine also the things that happened there, such as beatings and other things. We put that inside Hard Mountain. There's no documented evidence that took place in Hard Mountain, so there is evidence that took place in Tule Lake. And so you take a little bit of artistic license because you have 2.5 hours to tell a story, and 10 different camps to try to blend together.
Out of everything that changed over the rewrite process, one role remained more or less intact, and not everyone was happy about that.
Tonight, Mike Masaoka, a truly great American, this is your life. George, come here, George.
Mike Masaoka was a polarizing figure. As National Secretary of the Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, Mike Masaoka urged cooperation with the US government, believing that embracing patriotism was the best way to prove loyalty. As he put it, he wanted to be a better American in a greater America. Just 7 months later, Pearl Harbor wiped out any goodwill Masaoka created. The 26-year-old suddenly found himself thrust into a national leadership role. The JACL initially voiced concerns over the mass evacuation, but with little experience in leadership and suspicion everywhere, the small organization gradually backed down. As the pressure mounted, one general told Masaoka that when it came to the relocation, they could do it the easy way, or they could do it the Army way.
And Mike would later tell audiences in speeches, do you want people murdered on the streets? Do you want tanks to come in and destroy the little ghettos we had enjoyed? I think we had no choice but to cooperate. I'm probably the only Japanese-American Sansei, third-generation Japanese-American. I'm probably the only Sansei journalist who ever interviewed Mike at length, pressing him on his wartime stance of accommodation. He was, I think, the ideal or the natural leader for the JACL at the time, but he did fear the weight of the government and what could happen if the JACL did not cooperate as the Army demanded they do.
Mike Masaoka, by some Japanese Americans, they felt like he didn't lead with enough ferocity. You're not doing enough to protect us. You sold us out. And there was deep resentment and hatred among many, including my maternal grandfather. He was not among those who went peacefully, or not that he was violent, but he did not. It was a very hard pill to swallow.
Mike Masaoka moved the JACL headquarters to Salt Lake City. He remained in a leadership role throughout the war. In 1942, Masaoka pitched the idea of creating a segregated combat unit for Nisei to fight in, a final attempt to prove loyalty by making the ultimate sacrifice. The US government turned the idea down. But less than a year later, Nisei were being recruited into the 442, and allegiance was being tested through a loyalty questionnaire. In the early drafts of the musical, Sammy idolized Mike Masaoka as a brother figure, until learning he backed the 442's formation to improve the community's image regardless of the high cost in lives.
And my maternal grandfather, he despised the Japanese American Citizens League. And I think George was of the same mindset. I'm very ginger when speaking for George.
Mike Masaoka was a great problem. He essentially was saying to the government, please love us. We're good Americans, but please love us. He became a hated person by a certain segment of the Japanese American community, certainly at Tule Lake.
And he's depicted in the early versions of Allegiance as a villain, as the villain. He's like the traitor of the people.
The complicated legacy of Mike Masaoka still hung over the Japanese American community as Allegiance prepared for its San Diego run. 6 years after George Takei served as the chairman of the Japanese American National Museum, former Secretary of Transportation Norma Mineta took over. Mineta's sister was married to Mike Masaoka, so he fought to redeem his brother-in-law's reputation any chance he could.
When we were developing Allegiance, I thought Norm should know what we're doing. And so during a break in our board meeting, I took Norm aside and told him that we are developing a Broadway musical on the story of the internment of Japanese Americans. Immediately, he turned and became intense. How's Mike treated? Tell me, how is he characterized? I mean, by that sudden turn, I was kind of turned aback. And I said, we are treating him factually. And I thought, Norm, I thought you should know. Let me just leave it at that. I'm not going to say anything else. And I walked away.
There were definitely some challenges in San Diego in that the JACL, which is still an active organization, we had representatives come and sit us down in a conference room to try to convince us not to write badly about Mike Masaoka, who cooperated with the government.
There was a whole number called Better Americans in a Greater America. And it was literally like a big song and dance that Mike Masaoka comes and teaches Sammy how to be a better American in this moment where people are looking down on your Japanese American community as being traitors.
There were concerns that this was presenting the JACL as something collaborationist with the anti-Japanese American government. And I think that they had concerns about how this might reflect upon them today.
In the script I had, in fact, climaxed with the Nisei veteran named Sammy, played by George Takei, in full dress, Nisei full 42 uniform, screaming at the spirit memory of Mike Masaoka, "You had me lead them to their deaths, you son of a bitch."
And I'll never forget, they just said, he has, living children, he has living grandchildren. We don't want to besmirch his reputation. And I just looked at this guy and I said, I feel for you. I get it. I feel for his family. I said, but he stepped up to be a public figure. We can't try to soften our story to meet the sensitivities of his family because the historical record stands.
Much like Les Mis and Miss Saigon, Allegiance told a fictional story against a real historical backdrop. Many concerns involving the script resolved themselves during rewrites. But the controversy surrounding Masaoka was just beginning. In San Diego, two worlds collided. Jay Kuo and Lorenzo Tione both made a living in the law and tech world, where arguments are won with logic, structure, and precision. Stafford Arima and Lynn Schenkel came from the theater, where instinct, emotion, and art drove decisions. The very nature of these two worlds didn't just differ, they pulled in opposite directions. This push and pull made it difficult to land on a unified vision for the show.
And I had been to drama school, but I had owned a business. And I essentially saw my role as become the communicating door between these two factions that were, each pulling the blanket off of the other.
We didn't agree on everything, but we agreed on some things. When you're right in the thick of it, there's so many different voices and things that come at you, and you sort of have to make sense of all of it.
The show was in a constant state of flux. Just when they solved one issue, another one popped up immediately after.
Every day, it was like stacks and stacks of new pages because we were trying everything under the sun to sort of try to boil down this huge historic event into something that was dramaturgically and dramatically satisfying.
We were on our feet for 8 hours every day. We were dancing, doing all of the things. I just remember it being so hard. But I remember the hard being wonderful too, because I was doing the show with my friends.
As Allegiance headed into its Sitz Probe, the first rehearsal with the full orchestra, director Stafford Arima realized something major was missing. And they needed to find it with only a few days before the start of previews.
Stafford calls the company meeting and he says, we have a leading lady, but we don't have a leading lady song. And I could feel every eye upon me at that moment. And I said, well, the Sitz Probe is in 10 days. And Lynn says, I'll need it from you in 3. And this is a Friday. So I was like, okay, I need to go write Lea Salonga her song.
And so I wrote a sketch for a song. Jay started working on it. He said, can we get something that's more specific? And I sat down and I wrote the story of Higher.
They settled on a simple idea. Young Kay being pushed on a swing by her mother, a moment of joy that stays with her. Later, after her mother's death, Kay steps into that same role and pushes Sammy on the swing instead. In the end, she grieves the life she never got to live before realizing it may be her turn to get back on the swing herself and finally soar higher and higher.
And the backyard swing was just me spitballing about, okay, so what would be in her yard in her childhood? There'd be laundry, maybe there'd be a tire swing. Oh, a swing, a swing higher. That's a metaphor that works.
I had worked with Mark basically on the idea behind the song, but I couldn't come up with the melody, So instead of working on the song, I went out dancing all night. And then I was hungover and still no song. And, by the end of the weekend, I had no song. And I was like, I'm going to have to go into rehearsal empty-handed and humiliated. I was so devastated. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I was driving into rehearsal, and then I just conceived of this melody. It just entered in my head, and I pulled over to the side of the road, and I just hummed it back and forth to myself a few times. I'm like, yeah, that's it.
Lynn Schenkel got to work orchestrating the song. deliberately not letting Jay Quo hear it until the rehearsal with the full orchestra.
I remember coming in and here is the song and learning the song and oh, frack, this is hard. But I remember it like, oh my God, here's the song.
Nobody really knew what this was going to sound like except for me. That is a moment that I'll never forget, hearing Leia sing that song with the orchestration for the first time, and the room just really exploded after that.
When Leia's happy, she jumps up and down. And it was so exciting. We knew that was the song at that moment. And Leia knew it too.
And at the end of the song, she comes running across the room to me, and just like we're in a dirty dance, she just jumps into my arms and I'm twirling her around, and we're just laughing and crying, and everybody's shouting, and it was just one of those unforgettable life moments where you just know that you nailed it, and the team nailed it, and Leia nailed it, and you didn't fail. So sometimes you write a song in half an hour, it becomes the signature song of the entire musical. And there's no magic to it. In fact, it's just procrastination and desperation.
Allegiance rolled into its first performance at the Old Globe on September 7th, 2012. The preview period of a show is always a time of trial and error. But for Allegiance, it would be a literal trial by fire. Nobody knew what to do with Hannah. The creative team painted themselves into a corner with the love story between the camp nurse and Sammy. Now they needed to find a way to bridge the gap between a hopeful young Sammy and the bitter old Sam who bookends the show. While they could justify Sammy pulling away from his family, separating him from Hannah proved more difficult. After all, he carried her picture with him into battle. Aceto's new script dealt with this by more or less just having her disappear at the end of the show.
So Sam falls in love with this Caucasian nurse at the camp, but we never deal with how that story ends, and did they ever reconnect, and what happens, and does Sam ever find love again? Like, what's going on? We just left it open.
With only 2 weeks of previews before the changes had to stop, the team went through 9 performances, still unsure of what to do.
While I was busy writing back at the hotel, Jay and Lorenzo and Telly were out having drinks and talking about the what to do with Hannah situation.
We're all sitting around at some dive bar, and we're all sitting around a table going, what do we do with Hannah? What do we do with Hannah? What do we do? And I think I was probably many whiskeys in. And I said, God, we should just kill her. We should just kill her. Can we kill her? And I was joking. I really was joking. And then I saw Lorenzo and Jay, and their gears turned. They're like, wait a minute. What if we do kill her?
I had like a double take and a moment to take it in, and I'm like, actually, that may very well work. And I remember talking to Mark and getting very excited about that. And feeling like we have to write this, because this literally would have involved removing a character from the last 15 minutes of the show, telling that performer that we were doing that change, changing quite a meaningful amount of the show a week into previews.
They also needed to find a way to justify her death in the story. They landed on an answer: the stockade. The consequences for George Takei's father answering no on the loyalty questionnaire were felt immediately. He and his family were sent with other so-called disloyals to the maximum security camp in Tule Lake, California.
That became the harshest of all the 10 camps, and they made it a harsh camp. There were 3 rows of barbed wire fence, as if the first one wouldn't work. They had sentry towers with machine guns installed in them, pointing down at the people. And they had half a dozen tanks patrolling the third barbed wire fence. I mean, it was a lot of controlled, outrageous overreaction to honest answers. I mean, truthful answers. And I remember waking up to a neighbor in our same barrack. The woman was sobbing and pleading, don't take him, please. And the children were all crying. And the father was taken away by Jeep. And they built what they called a jailhouse. They called it the Stockade.
Tule Lake was the only camp to allow military police inside the perimeter, and the only one to have a military stockade, a prison within a prison. The three writers of Allegiance mapped out Hannah's death in full, and the rippling effects it would have on the rest of the story. For the shocking moment, the creative team of Allegiance created a fictional stockade at Heart Mountain. While Sammy was away at war, Frankie was imprisoned after resisting the loyalty questionnaire and was physically beaten by a guard. While he was being taken to the hospital for his wounds, tensions escalated when Kay tried to intervene and the guard accidentally fired his gun, killing Hannah, who ended up in the confrontation. Sammy only learned of her death after he returned from the war. The moment was shocking and directly tied Sammy's bitterness to Kay and Frankie.
And it actually was the thing that makes Kay's allegiance to Frankie unforgivable, the fact that Hannah had to die for it.
After the team okayed it with Stafford Arima and Lynn Schenkel, it went into Allegiance that same day. But killing off the love interest wasn't the boldest choice the team made during previews. In a moment drawn directly from the historical record, the creative team incorporated an incident from the camps in which internees built a stuffed scarecrow in the likeness of Mike Masaoka. Angered by the JACL's cooperation with the government, the internees spat on it, urinated on it, and then ultimately hung it and lit it on fire.
And so we said, oh, that would be amazing for the end of the first act. Not the, pissing on him, but the effigy, burning effigy. And we tried it one night, and this sort of like scarecrow goes flying up, towards the top of the stage. And
it was quite it was visually arresting. And I think someone took like an iPhone video of it.
I took the video of it, and it just that was the one and only time it ever appeared. Like, we all looked at it and we just said, in the words of Stafford, death. Stafford has shorthand for when something is working or not working, and if something is not working, all he just says is death. And we all just knew, yeah, forget it. We're not doing the burning of the effigy.
I think it disturbed too many people, so including myself. I mean, in many ways, we'll keep that as a snapshot of something that happens in an out-of-town tryout.
One death that remained, however, was Hannah's. In a story rooted in real events, those creative liberties wouldn't go unnoticed. George Takei was no stranger to opening nights. But the curtain call for the world premiere of Allegiance felt different. This wasn't a role he could simply step out of. It was his own lived history. And he had just brought that story to life in front of 1,400 people. When the audience broke into a standing ovation, it wasn't just for the show, it was for George Takei's courage in telling it. Allegiance played to consistently full houses, with audience members leaving the theater holding empty tissue packets. Over the course of its 7-week run, the show brought in over $2 million, dethroning the 2007 post-Broadway transfer of Avenue Q by approximately $500,000 and making it the highest-grossing musical in Old Globe history. Audience-wise, Allegiance was an undisputed smash. But review-wise, not so much. Most outlets were quick to praise the orchestrations, the directions, and the performances, but they also criticized a missed opportunity to fully engage with the complex source material. Variety wrote, Allegiance comes dangerously close to branding every member of the 442nd as fools and dupes. In response to the musical, the Japanese American Veterans Association penned a 5-page open letter, calling out factual inaccuracies, denouncing the presentation of the 442, and declaring that without fundamental change, the play was a Titanic doomed to hit an iceberg of facts and history. Another party concerned about the factual inaccuracies was Frank Abe, the filmmaker of the documentary Conscience and the Constitution.
It was like reading something that was science fiction. It was so off kilter. The facts were all wrong about the camps and about Mike Masaoka and the Fair Play Committee. I want to be very clear about something, Brendon. I have no issue with Mr. Takei, Mr. George Takei. He's a leader in our community, and he graciously provided a voice of Frank Anthony and James O'Mora in my PBS film, and I'm very grateful to him for that. So I have no issue with Mr. Takei. He was an actor playing a part. I did reach out to Mr. Takei, and I sent him a kind of side-by-side comparison of my film and the script that I saw. And he thanked me for my work to bring the story forward. And I think rightly pointed out that I had no copyright claim because you can't copyright the facts of history. And so if they went back and reverse engineered my framework with their own research, their own facts, that's, not actionable.
Coming out of a solid San Diego showing, everybody thought it would be a quick trip to Broadway. With any luck, they might even hit the 2012 deadline Tione set years earlier. A week passed, then a month, then a year. Nothing happened. Even though they broke box office records, received multiple awards, and packed the show with a star-studded cast, theater owners in New York City still seemed skeptical over the commercial appeal of a musical about unconstitutional incarceration. Leading up to this, Allegiance was always an artistic venture at its core. But if it wanted to make it to Broadway, it needed to become a business venture. Dozens of posters lined the wall directly beneath the offices of the Shubert Organization in New York City. Each one a dream achieved. Up above, Lorenzo Tione sat at a long boardroom table, ready to cast his wish on the wind. As an entrepreneur and investor, he understood the importance of staying top of mind, and began meeting with the Shubert Organization at least once a month. The company owned 17 of New York's 41 theaters, many of them fitting the intimate 900 to 1,000 seat range Tione envisioned for Allegiance. But the goal of opening on Broadway in 2012 was long past. And now, even a transfer in the 2013-2014 season looked unlikely. Not only were all the theaters booked, but the theater owners weren't taking them seriously. To change that perception, Tione brought George Takei to share his story with them personally. Life inside the camps looked vastly different through the eyes of a child. At 5 years old, George and his brother had caught dragonflies, visited hogs on a farm, and built a snowman for the first time.
Especially for the younger kids, camp could be kind of fun. Like a lot of them had never been around so many Japanese American people. And so they made friendships, and they had sports, and they had ice skating.
When the guards were not watching, we would sneak out from the fence and go down to the river to enjoy a day on the swimming. But I remember it's a very brief stay, and we always went back to the camp before sunset.
But the veil of childhood innocence lifted itself for George Takei inside Tule Lake. Every day, he was surrounded by seething anger amongst Nisei, who said, "If you want to categorize us as enemies, we'll show you what kind of enemies you have to contend with."
They jogged every morning with a headband, with the rising sun, with the rays painted in red on their white headband. And they jogged around the camp with the cadence, "Washoi, washoi, washoi, washoi." And then at the end, they would all gather together and say, "Banzai, banzai, banzai." And that exacerbated more tension in the camp.
George Takei reflected on these experiences, the good and the bad, sitting in the office of the Schubert Organization.
In retrospect, I think that was a little bit of a rookie move. It's not like the theater owners are going to be particularly starstruck or swayed by any celebrities. They knew this was George's story. They knew George was committed to it. Leia was already attached. It was very unclear whether or not George would sell tickets as a per se, right? And I think that was a legitimate question to have.
For 2 years, even with the monthly meetings, nobody at the Schubert Organization blinked an eye at Allegiance. With no sign of a Broadway transfer on the horizon, cast and other creative team members began moving on to different projects.
And as the months went by and the years went by, it sort of felt like it wasn't going to happen. And if it did, I may not eventually be able to be a part of it.
We thought, oh, we've got a show well reviewed in San Diego. We got great reviews in San Diego. Like, come on, let's go. We thought it was that simple. No. That's not how the Old Boys Network works. Right? And I was worried, it's like, oh my God, George is going to get too old to play this.
Tione and Quo needed to get more aggressive. So, they started selling tickets. In February 2014, Tione launched the Allegiance Priority Access Pass, where people could pay $5 non-refundable dollars to hold their place in line for early access tickets to the Broadway production if and when it was announced. The show didn't have a date. It didn't even have a theater, and yet thousands of people paid and signed up.
We wanted to show that there were a bunch of people that were willing to give us money that they were not going to see back just for the privilege of potentially buying a ticket to Broadway if and when that Broadway production would happen. And then the next time I went in for an update and Bob sits down, he's like, "So I hear you've been selling tickets already."
On paper, it looked like the demand was there, but they still needed to convince the head of the Schubert Organization, Bob Wankel, that Allegiance was a Broadway quality show. Months passed, and still, no theaters committed. 3 years earlier, the team pitched Allegiance to producer Kevin McCollum, who referred to George Takei as a pop curiosity, noting that while he had a strong following, he wasn't considered an A-list star. The comment stuck with Lorenzo Tione and Jay Quo, who realized they needed to expand Takei's visibility. In 2011, they approached him about joining Twitter.
And he said, well, I have a blog. I'm like, well, it's not quite the same thing.
It was like, well, is it okay if we help you? We'll kind of run content by you and you can tell us what you want to post and we'll manage all of the day-to-day for you and so on.
The two helped him build an account that quickly took off by focusing on content tailored to his interests, like sci-fi and cat memes. What began as a promotional tool for Allegiance soon grew into a massive online presence. By the end of the year, Takei was the #1 account on both Twitter and Facebook. That unexpected rise in influence became a key asset in the hunt for a Broadway theater. In July 2014, Professor Lawrence Lessig was close to missing a $6 million fundraising goal for a super PAC just days before his July 4th deadline. He turned to George Takei and his roughly 7 million followers for help, and a coordinated social media push raised about $750,000. As luck would have it, Lessig also held Harvard's Roy L. Furman Professorship of Law and Leadership. This meant he had ties to Roy L. Furman himself, a Broadway producer who worked closely with the Schuberts. Seeing an opportunity, Jaquo met with Lessig and asked him to talk about Allegiance with Furman, hoping it would carry weight with the Schuberts.
That was a roundabout way of saying, hey, we know people too, right? And you're going to hear about it from Roy Furman, who you do a lot of shows with.
The leaves of Central Park turned orange as Tione and Quo waited for a phone call that never came. Needing to plan their next move, the two decided to take a vacation out of the city. As they soaked in the sun, the phone rang. It was Bob Wankel. He agreed to give Allegiance a theater for the 2015-2016 Broadway season.
I dropped to my knees and I was so thankful it's finally happening.
The creative team still had to wait until December 2014 to learn what theater would eventually become their home. As luck would have it, Lorenzo Tione caught the moment on film. He had hired documentary filmmaker Greg Vanderveer to capture the show's journey to Broadway. And Vanderveer just so happened to be in the apartment when they found out.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Bye-bye. And we have the Longacre.
Are you serious?
Yeah, we have the Longacre.
Are you serious?
Yes.
We have a home.
We have a home.
We have a home.
Don't you? I feel like we just found out we're pregnant. It's really weird.
The call came early. So I walked in out of the cold and they told me as I walked in the door and I immediately started to cry and my glasses completely fogged up.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I wasn't expecting dreams to come true when I walked in.
Allegiance finally had a home, just 2 blocks away from where they first talked about the idea at In the Heights 6 years earlier. Little did they know, the Longacre held a reputation as one of the most difficult theaters to sell out on Broadway. Making matters worse, nobody saw the competition about to rise up. The debate over historical accuracy and creative liberty surrounded every aspect of Allegiance's transfer to Broadway, especially after the reaction to Mike Masaoka in San Diego. Most real-life characters in the show were softened behind fictional names. Mike Masaoka and the JACL were not. In addition to Masaoka's big dance number, Better Americans in a Greater America, the show also included a song called Paradise, in which Frankie Suzuki mercilessly mocks Mike Masaoka for selling out his own people in pursuit of acceptance. In July of 2015, Norman Mineta attended the JACL National Convention in Las Vegas, Nevada. According to Frank Abe, at one point over the weekend, Mineta said that while he and George Takei shared much in common, in the portrayal of Mike Masaoka, George was dead wrong.
We had one ally on the JACL who was pleased with how we did right by the legacy. But I recall I think it was a veteran from the 442. I was looking for some corroboration of some facts. And I got on the phone with this guy, and I was so excited to be able to share with him what I was doing. And he stopped me and he said, "Wait, I've heard about your show. You're that show that says Mike Masaoka was a traitor. I have nothing to say to you." And he hung up on me. So that's how real the wounds were. They were still there.
There were people, Japanese Americans, who came to our show who really opposed the way we portrayed Mike Masaoka.
One of the loudest objections came from the JACL itself. Learning that Allegiance was Broadway-bound, the JACL released a statement saying they were disturbed the play used the actual names of the organization and Mike Masaoka, claiming that by using actual names, audience members may forget that they are watching a historical fiction. Taking the criticisms of Masaoka's portrayal into account, the team rewrote the character and removed his musical number, though the parody, Paradise, remained. For Broadway, they decided the character would speak largely through direct quotes attributed to the real Mike Masaoka.
I think ultimately what we did was we tried to humanize Mike as much as we could, which is why you see a moment with Mike on the phone with his brother talking about our mother's in a horse stable. What are you doing about it? That Mike, too, was a victim of the circumstance of what was happening and probably making the best decisions he possibly could in that moment.
Aceto wrote a new final monologue for Mike Masaoka that drew inspiration from a speech he gave at the 1982 JACL National Convention. He described the situations following Pearl Harbor, of legislators who wanted to sterilize men of Japanese ancestry so they wouldn't breed like rats, of violent threats from the military, and of senators who wanted to deport all Japanese and Japanese Americans to an island they could blow up in the Pacific. Masaoka admitted not all decisions made by the JACL were correct, but that no one could be correct under those circumstances, and that every decision they made was because they honestly and sincerely believed it was for the good of those of Japanese ancestry in the United States. Aceto also highlighted the causes Masaoka dedicated the remainder of his life to, from lobbying the US government for reparations to advocating for full citizenship of the Issei.
As the development of the show happened, we couldn't pick sides. And I think for a little while, we were trying to dramatize an antagonist and a villain in this story. And Mike Masaoka was not the villain. The villain of the piece is fear and prejudice. That's the villain of the piece.
In December 1944, the United States Supreme Court heard 4 wartime cases involving Japanese Americans who challenged their forced removal and incarceration. Only one case involving a 22-year-old DMV worker named Mitsuye Endo succeeded. She worked with a lawyer recruited by the JACL to file a writ of habeas corpus, challenging the government's authority to detain her without cause.
Endo's case, being a civil case, actually prevailed in the Supreme Court and led to the order that the camps be closed and American citizens be allowed to return home. By then, of course, the war was nearly over, and so there was little opposition to this idea.
Each incarceree was given $25 and a bus or train ticket. It said, okay, go anywhere you want. Here's $25, good luck. And the majority of people, my family included, had lost everything. You know, they had businesses and homes on the West Coast, but in most cases, those businesses and homes had been ransacked. There was nothing for them to go home to.
The worst hit were people who had farms, because the farmers, when they came back, they had nothing to come back to. And a lot of people would not sell farms to Japanese. In my case, it turns out my father, we had really good luck. My father had a friend who was a white attorney, and this white attorney took care of our home, had it rented, serviced the mortgage, and we were able to move right back into our same house. So it was a very unusual arrangement.
After leaving camp, people of Japanese ancestry returned to a society that had largely moved on without them. Little Tokyo had been transformed into Bronzeville, a hub of African American life, while many displaced families crowded into temples, and those labeled no-nos were shunned by their own community. 8 months later, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands and forcing Japan to surrender. As soldiers returned to their ticker tape parades, former incarcerees faced shock, displacement, and concern for their loved ones in Japan. The creative team clashed over how to show this contrast on stage. In San Diego, they tried a version that moved from a somber, quiet moment into a flash of blinding light and then cut straight into a big swing number about winning the war. These debates continued behind the scenes as Allegiance started Broadway previews on October 6th, 2015. As a data lover, Tione hired a company to gauge audience members' reactions to the show. While the majority of people enjoyed Allegiance, Tione noticed a concerning number of people who found the transition from Hiroshima to Victory Swing problematic. In Tione's view, the irony of the number wasn't coming through. The idea that America was celebrating the freeing of Europe, while at home, it had just imprisoned thousands of its own citizens. Arima and Quo pushed back, suggesting the discomfort might be the point. As Arima put it, it was the one moment in the show that actually held a mirror up to the audience and made them question what America did. Victory Swing was just one instance of the larger struggle amongst the creative team in terms of tone.
Commercial entertainment tells the audience what they want to believe. Alternative entertainment tells them the uncomfortable truth they don't want to believe. And Stafford and Lynn were definitely on that team. They were like, oh, it's got to be grittier, darker, more disturbing, da-da-da. And Jay and Lorenzo were panicked that meant that nobody was going to want to see this show. So they were pushing for, can we find the uplift? Can we get the positive side of this?
In early meetings, many of the marketing and advertising agencies raised concerns that the subject matter of Allegiance might shame white audiences into feeling too guilty to buy a ticket. AKA, the agency in charge of advertising, wanted to avoid becoming an issue show, or one that held a political agenda. DKC O&M, the agency in charge of press, wanted to become an issue show, because it could get them on national outlets like NBC Nightly News and 60 Minutes. With only a few weeks until opening night, ticket sales weren't moving as fast as they'd hoped. Back in the theater, the rehearsals blurred as scenes were cut, lines were added, songs rewritten, and the entire structure of Act 1 reorganized.
Changes were flying. Sometimes I would go into a side room, have a quick creative meeting, and then I'd be off to another room to go rewrite 2 sections of what we just did. I would go and do rewrites, bring it back. The cast would learn it. I mean, the pages were flying. It was intense.
One of my favorite memories is it was in performance, in previews at the Longacre Theater. And at one point, I think George at one point says, okay, shut up, I don't want to hear it anymore. And at one point, George on a Broadway stage says, oh, Gloria, I don't want to hear it anymore. And we were all like, oh my God, did George just call Lea Salonga Gloria? And Gloria has not existed since our reading in 2011.
And you could just feel the audience go, who's Gloria? Like, it's just...
But I do remember the feeling of, wait, hang on. That's not my name anymore, George.
We're trying to keep all the changes in our head, and we're trying to keep track of all of it. But sometimes our muscle memory and our emotional memory kicks in, and sometimes that memory goes as far back as 4 years ago when I did that reading and your character was called something else. Bless him.
Just when it seemed like the creative team was out of the woods in terms of major changes, they told Jay Quo to write an entirely new final number. They were less than a week away from opening night. Quo felt the current song, Second Chances, was already doing its job. It'd been with the show since the beginning, and audiences loved it in San Diego. But others felt it was sappy and felt too Hallmark in nature.
They pressed and pressed and pressed, and that I think was the thing that was sort of hardest for me to give on, but I did give on and wrote something else, which I think was fine, but I'll never know like whether Second Chances would have been the better ending. I think it's a team that had not worked on a Broadway show together before. We sort of fell into one trap, which was that we overworked the dough. We made a lot of changes. So many that I took the song Second Chances and I made a spoof out of it called Second Guessing. We are always second guessing.
Every night, the creative team watched the performances, gave the cast notes, then retreated upstairs to one of the producers' apartments for late night working sessions. Through each decision, a debate inevitably followed.
The biggest challenge to writing the show was to get a unified vision for the whole team. It was simply a situation of just too many cooks. And it started in San Diego. It was there, throughout the entire process. So there was like a committee of equals, if you will, a balance of power of equals that then meant that we were constantly at odds trying to find the story. And none of that is personal. Like that was just the facts of the difficulty of doing the project.
Second Guessing continued until October 30th, 2015. After 7 years of working on Allegiance in living rooms, rehearsal halls, museums, regional stages, and finally Broadway, director Stafford Arima announced that the show was frozen. No more changes could be made.
Having to make all those changes with a paying audience was stressful on everybody. And I was so relieved when we finally froze the show. I went out and I got a bag of ice and we handed it from person to person as we announced that the show was indeed frozen. I heard from other veterans, house manager, ushers, stage managers, to say they had never seen a show change so much from first preview to final preview. And I take them at their word on that.
In an instant, the debates, the frustrations, and the stress melted away. If only for a moment. They'd done it. They got Allegiance to Broadway. The chaos had stemmed from everybody on the team wanting to create the best show possible. Not only for themselves, but for George Takei. They knew this was his legacy project, and they didn't want to let him down. Now, they just needed to open. Out of 35 plays and musicals that opened in the 2014-2015 Broadway season, only 2 focused on the experiences of non-white Americans, a trend the 2015-2016 season wanted to change. To say diversity was lacking on Broadway around this time puts it lightly. It had been roughly 13 years since a musical opened on Broadway with an AAPI-led cast. The last time was Flower Drum Song in 2002, a production that coincidentally featured Lea Salonga and Telly Leung.
It was great for the two of us to be part of this other company where we got to be part of a majority AAPI company on Broadway and in San Diego. Regardless of what audiences would say or what the critics would say, it's like we need to be part of this because we have to help make it easier for other people that look like us down the line to get to this point.
In order to get more people into the theater to see the show and tell their friends, producers lowered ticket prices for the final week of previews. And yet, they still only played to 74% capacity, while other shows like Aladdin played in the high 90%. This put the team in a complicated spot. They needed to raise prices to recoup the $13 million investment, but they also needed to get more people in to talk about the show with others. If the show wanted any fighting chance, it needed solid reviews. Allegiance represented a landmark moment on Broadway, with over 70% of the entire cast being Asian and Asian American. For most of the creative team and cast, it also marked their Broadway debuts.
It was my debut. I was in my 70s.
When we first opened on Broadway, I pulled Lea Salonga aside and I said, listen, for many of these people, this is their Broadway debut. I said, this is a risk to do this as a commercial Broadway venture. I said, we might be open for one day. We might be open for 4 weeks. We might be open for 4 months. We might be open for 4 years. We might win a Tony Award. Who knows? But let's make every day of this experience for those people the best it can be. For me, I know that when I had that conversation with Lea and we made that sort of that silent pact together, I felt like every day that we got to do that show was a blessing.
What's wonderful about Allegiance is that at its core, more than anything else, it was a story about an American family. They represent the families as Americans first and not foreigners. So I think that's what made it incredibly different, especially on Broadway, because you finally saw us as a part of the greater community at large in terms of the American experience.
Allegiance opened at the Longacre Theater on November 8th, 2015. As with all other versions of the show, it ended with the audience applauding through tears.
And George came out for his curtain call, and the audience, of course, rose to their feet with a roar. And here's this, 78-year-old man. It boggles the mind to even think about what it must have felt like to have been imprisoned with your family as a child, and then to be on stage telling a version of that story for an audience that is just embracing you. And he was just thunderstruck. No one expected that moment. And it was, I'll never forget the beauty of that.
10 blocks away, the marketing team at The Social Edge scrolled on their computers, reading the opening night reviews. They needed to find a series of positive quotes to help finally ignite the word of mouth they'd been waiting for.
It's one of those blurry nights where it all just becomes way too much to sink in, and you have that red carpet and you kind of feel a sense of we've arrived, we made it. The blood, sweat, and tears, it was all worth it. And you experience that as just a moment of it all started back when an email was sent years ago. And then the next phase happens, which is when all the reviews start to come in, right? And then you start reading them and you start seeing people that are very supportive of the show. And then you see people that are less supportive of the show.
The reviews that we got, I think there was like one wonderful one that we had received, but we got a few lukewarm, not absolute like pans. I don't think we got anything like that. I mean, my personal notices were great, and I'm thankful for them, but I really would have wanted more positive notices on the show. But the show is what the show is.
The main criticisms for the show were the same that the creative team dealt with from the start. Critics felt the show didn't take a definitive stance, and often veered into what they viewed as melodrama instead of embracing the facts. In the New York Times review, critic Charles Isherwood even pointed to an article Frank Abe published a week before opening, titled, "Allegiance Uplifts by Doctoring Japanese American History." In the review, Abe objected to the treatment of Japanese American history throughout the musical, specifically with how the show singled out Mike Masaoka instead of pointing to the government's mass injustice. He also noted inaccuracies rooted in merging the camps together, which altered and conflated historical facts. This included the burning of draft cards, which was a later invention of the 1960s. He felt that depicting the draft resistors hiding from guards, leading riots, and raising their fists in protests was disrespectful to Frank Emmy and the real Heart Mountain resistors. And for Abe, one final violation of history was the killing of Hannah.
4 men were shot and killed in America's wartime camps. Each of them a person of Japanese ancestry. No white woman was ever killed in camp, much less by another white person. None. Not ever. And such an incident would have rocked the course of American history, made headlines, and be remembered today. I think a Japanese American author would not have allowed such wild exaggerations, such wild fabrications of the historical record to appear on the Broadway stage, which is not to say that a non-Japanese American cannot write this story, but it sure helps.
I never in a million years would presume to tell a Japanese American story, but being invited to tell a Japanese American story with the support of Stafford and George, I felt like I had people in the room who could guide me towards being able to tell the story through their lens.
I was very mindful of that too, because I'm not Japanese. I'm Chinese American. At the same time, you can't tell a PBS documentary as a musical. It's not gonna fly, right? And I think that it was always a struggle of like, how much of this history do we actually want to tell? And we kept wanting to come back to telling the story of the family, right? I don't think we ever set out to tell the definitive historical version of the internment. No, that's not what we set out to do. We set out to tell a story about a family's struggles during the time of the internment.
We felt an immense responsibility to tell it in a way that would honor the survivors and the dead, for that matter. There are certain historical dates and facts that are absolutely verifiable, Googleable. You have to stand by those. You can't just start making that up. But the emotions and the causality and how people responded in those moments is certainly fair game.
The cast and creative team felt disheartened to read the less than stellar reviews, but tried to shrug them off and celebrate the big night. However, without a glowing ray of review, ticket sales for Allegiance sank. Word of mouth never caught, and the show struggled to break into the national conversation. By late December, it faced a familiar choice: resist or comply. George Takei chose to resist. "30 years after the final camps closed, survivors, alongside groups like the JACL, put up a renewed fight over the mass incarceration of 1942. Collectively, Japanese and Japanese Americans who were forced into concentration camps lost more than $6 billion when adjusted for inflation. The Japanese American redress movement emerged in the 1970s, which pushed for reparations and a formal apology from the US government. George Takei testified before Congress in 1981. He shared his personal story and declared that restitution would be a bold move to strengthen the integrity of America. The movement succeeded. And in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed legislation issuing a formal apology and $20,000 to each surviving member of the internment. Takei dedicated his money to the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. In the years that followed, Heart Mountain resistor Frank Emmy challenged the JACL to apologize for its wartime collaboration. The JACL responded, and on May 11, 2002, 24 Nisei resistors attended a public ceremony in San Francisco, where the JACL apologized for its suppression of wartime resistance and awarded each of them with plaques for their courage. Many hoped this would finally bring closure to a dark chapter of American history, a chapter defined by wartime hysteria, racial prejudice, and a failure of political leadership. 13 years later, Telly Leung got a push notification from the New York Times. presidential candidate Donald Trump announced he was doubling down on his call to block all Muslims from entering the United States. The date was December 8th, 2015, one day removed from the 74th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. The cast was assembled to record the cast album for Allegiance.
And I said, wow, if this doesn't drill home how important our show is to tell this story from the 1940s, to tell it now in this particular moment, I don't know what does, getting this news alert from the New York Times while I'm singing this score from these characters, right?
George Takei knew Donald Trump well. A year before Allegiance premiered in San Diego, he appeared on The Celebrity Apprentice. During a 2011 press conference for the show, Takei challenged Trump to a lunch discussion on marriage equality. Trump accepted. After reading Trump's 2015 interviews in Time magazine and the New York Times, Takei decided to challenge him again.
One of the journalists had asked, "What do you think of the internment of Japanese Americans?" And he said, "Well, I don't know because I wasn't there. I wasn't there to see it." And I thought, if he wasn't there, this is a good facsimile. Allegiance is a good facsimile of what the internment was like. He should come see it. So I sent him an invitation saying, "I personally invite you to come see Allegiance so that you will know what that was like. I would save you a seat on the aisle in the orchestra section." And then I went on TV, talk shows, and made it very public that we invited him to come see Allegiance so he would know that chapter of American history.
The production did exactly as promised and hung a sign on an aisle seat saying, "This seat reserved for Donald Trump."
He never occupied it, but during the intermission, a couple of people would line up there and hunker down and get a photo taken of them with that sign right next to it. So we sold a few tickets as a result of that sign.
Moments like that spoke to what Allegiance had been striving for all along: to stand out on Broadway by telling a lesser-known chapter of American history with a largely diverse cast. However, a young, scrappy, and hungry show seized that spotlight first.
Those in the know on Broadway say a hit like Hamilton comes around maybe every 7 to 10 years.
The cast wowed Grammy viewers. Tickets are sold out throughout at least January next year.
Could you get us 400 tickets to Hamilton?
Look on the
In its opening week on Broadway, Allegiance grossed $572,000. That same week, Hamilton grossed $1.5 million. The hip-hop retelling of Alexander Hamilton opened on August 6th, 2015, to rave reviews, strong word of mouth, and consistently sold-out houses. Creator Lin-Manuel Miranda appeared on 60 Minutes and NBC Nightly News to debate the significance of recasting white founding fathers with BIPOC actors and defended the historical inaccuracies in the show. His impressive social media following connected with people. Not only did it create avid fans, but it also motivated those fans to buy tickets. Most perplexing, however, was the way in which Hamilton, a show deeply political in nature, managed to appeal to people on both sides of the political spectrum.
Hamilton managed to find that sweet spot where they could be something that both Barack Obama and Dick Cheney could agree on. This story that uplifts these white forefathers but tells it through the lens of diversity so that people can see themselves in the story.
I always said that the chronic cost of creating a show in Lin-Manuel Miranda's first hit musical was to open opposite his second. So, that was a challenge that none of us had expected.
And it was a very, very difficult season to command any kind of attention, especially for a show like us that had come to Broadway with the idea of hanging its message on the fact that it was a new original musical about an unspoken chapter of American history with a largely diverse cast. All of those talking points had already been taken, and the oxygen had been sucked out of the room entirely.
Hamilton basically obliterated all the competition on Broadway, so you know what? I'm not too mad at Lin-Manuel Miranda for it. Not too mad, but they're pushing other boundaries as well. So I'll give them that pass.
I started noticing a day hasn't gone by with some well-meaning person saying, "So have you seen Hamilton? Isn't it fantastic? Don't you love it?" I'm like, "Yeah, it's genius. It's great." But, we're telling our thing. It was annoying having everybody you meet talk about Hamilton every single day when your Broadway dream is coming true.
As the weeks passed, Hamilton's box office grew leaps and bounds, while Allegiance fell further and further in the red. The producers tried everything they could to hold on, but after the holiday rush in tourism failed to bump up their attendance, the writing was on the wall.
We sort of knew that we were a show in financial trouble. Didn't take away at all from how proud we were of the show and how much we gave to the people that did buy tickets, to the people that did sit there. We gave 110% of ourselves every single night to that audience. But we also knew the realities that when a show is in trouble, it's going to close.
We could see what kind of attendances we were getting. The reviews that we got. So, yeah.
Out of its entire time on Broadway, the show only saw one profitable week. By late December, Bob Wankel from the Schuberts asked Lorenzo Tione what he wanted to do. Try to hold on for the Tony Awards or close. Tione knew there was no chance they'd make it to June. He gathered the cast and crew in the auditorium of the Longacre on January 6th, 2016, and announced the news everyone knew was coming. The show would close on February 14th.
We closed on Valentine's Day in 2016. And I was like, oh, God. Yeah, I know, you're just like, I can see you shaking your head.
What were you feeling during that time?
I think I got drunk. No, I do remember having a drink at the cast party and wearing my Allegiance onesie because I needed to feel comfort.
The day of loadout, I went to the theater to see if there were any sort of props or souvenirs that I could steal. So I walked into the theater by myself, and of course all the cases were there and people were, dismantling things. And I looked around and I just thought, wow, it looks just like Load-In. And that full circle of this is just the life cycle. Okay, sure, we only played 100 some odd performances, but regardless, the show always closes.
Allegiance played its final show on February 14th, 2016, after 37 previews and 113 regular performances. It played to a total of 120,000 people, the same number of Japanese and Japanese Americans who were forced into World War II concentration camps. The journey of Allegiance was a lot like folding a paper flower. It took persistence and patience to build something meaningful, piece by piece. Though it looks simple at first glance, underneath are a bunch of intricate small folds that all come together to create something special. The paper became a symbol. When George Takei looked up at the marquee for allegiance at the Longacre, the first thing he said was, "I wish my father and mother could see this." At opening, Takei was 78 years old, 4 years older than his father was when he passed away. And still, the fallout from their dinner argument haunted him. In the final scene of Allegiance, Takei could finally say the words he never said. "I'm sorry." Standing beneath the lights, it was no longer the 78-year-old George Takei reading a monologue to a theater of 1,000 people. It was the 5-year-old boy who sat alongside his mother and armed guards on the train, who slept alongside his family in a musty barrack, who searched for dinosaurs through barbed wire fences, who watched his parents whisper by lamplight, who spent the rest of his life resisting.
My father was a true hero, and I impressed on them the heroic role that he played.
In the show's final moments, George Takei and the ensemble gathered to sing one final word: Gaman.